Well, it's basically about what the title says. It's about the end of the regime. Which regime? Authoritarian, conservative, right-wing dictatorships in Europe of the mid 70s of the last century, and the Russian regime, Soviet regime, and the possible end of the modern regime led by Vladimir Putin. Why I have chosen this topic? I did it in around 2019, 2020, because at that time it was clear that Russian regime is a dictatorship. It is a right-wing dictatorship in the sense of its ideology. It started to produce a classical right-wing populist narrative, not totally identical to what we see now in what, I don't know, other right politicians are saying, not totally identical to what was done by the leader of right-wing regimes in Europe of the last century, but ideologically it was not similar to the Soviet one, to the Soviet regime. And it was long. It was clear that after crossing the threshold of 2020, so of its fourth and fifth term, Vladimir Putin will remain one of the longest rulers in Russian history. And more and more people, increasingly more people, started to question, to ask themselves how this type of regime may end. And what they remembered first, of course, the end of the Soviet regime, because the majority of now living Russians remember how their own dictatorships ended in the recent past, just 30 years ago. And it's an aging country, so the majority of Russians remember how one dictatorship, one authoritarian regime ended. Of course, it doesn't mean that they understand properly what happened at that time, but they do. So it's their first experience. Then they remember another thing from history: the end of Nazis' dictatorship in Germany, fascist dictatorship in Italy. Both cases are slightly, or not slightly, considerably irrelevant for what's going on in Russia right now. Russia cannot be defeated, as we see now, militarily, at least strategically. It can be defeated on local level by low-scale local war, as it happened with the Soviet Union or with Russian Empire before. But it cannot be defeated in the style of Germany in the mid of last century, by the end of the Second World War, because of the nukes, because of the nuclear weapon, not to mention the size, the population, the size of the territory, which is unoccupiable, let's say. But the nukes prevent Russia to be military defeated strategically. Then what remains is the Soviet past, the experience of the end of the Soviet regime, which is, again, irrelevant, because the collapse of the Soviet Union had mostly economic reasons in a very simple way. The Soviet regime was not able to feed its population, to feed the citizens of the Soviet Union, who were queuing by the end of the Soviet Union for food. It's not like now. Now, even with the sanctions, Russian market is pretty much okay. Russia continues, even after the beginning of the war, continues to be a consumerist society with prosperous and thriving economy. And the ideology of modern Russia is not similar to the Soviet ideology. It's not, let's say, progressist even in words. It's conservative. It's about traditional values, about saving the Christianity in Europe, and so on and so on. It's very, very unsimilar, very unlike to what we had in the Soviet Union. So this combination of right-wing ideology with private capitalist market economy and the very oppressive classical dictatorship that Russia became after the invasion in Ukraine of 2022 made me think that we need to compare modern Russia and to think how its regime may end with other examples, to put it in a slightly different and maybe more accurate role. And It was always interesting for me because as a kid, as a child, I remember this transition to democracy of Spain, Portugal, Greece. It was interesting for myself, and it appeared that was of highest interest to Russian readers because Russian readers were amazed to see how in words, in rhetorics, in behavior of the leaders, their country is similar to what the Mediterranean Europe, the Southern Europe had in mid of 70s or 60s or 50s. I wrote a book that was trying to answer one question obvious to all thinking Russians: how a long dictatorship led by one almighty person can end. But of course, when I was thinking about the foreign edition, I understood very soon that for the foreign readers, these parallels are not that clear. And to explain, to show why this book was important for modern Russia, for understanding modern Russia, I added the end of the Soviet Union, the Russian authoritarian modernity, and with some thoughts, some considerations about the possible end of the modern Russian authoritarian regime. When there, the question arises how much Russian audience has understood my intention and the task of this book. Sales in Russia show that they have understood very well. It got on the market in the end of January of 2023 and immediately became a bestseller. It was the second year of the full-scale war against Ukraine. Russian regime at that time looked less self-confident as by now. In this year, Russia has changed enormously inside, domestically. The domestic politics ceased to exist as it used to be before the war. And even the most, let's say, indifferent, skeptical people have understood that they are living in a dictatorship. How this can end, what may expect us as the citizens of such a country. Even in a personalist regime, there are contradictions. There are groups competing to each other. There are cracks. There is a possibility of divisions when the street activity, the independent political activity, the opposition activity is almost impossible, too dangerous, totally suppressed, is important for those who hope to the end of the regime, to the transition of democracy, because you don't perceive the dictatorship as a monolith. You see the cracks and the groups inside. You understand that these groups have different interests, and at some stage, especially when the leader goes, some of these groups may become tactical allies of very debilitated, let's say, weakened opposition, and then together with these groups from inside the regime, the opposition, which doesn't seem have a chance right now because it's too weak, too dismembered, with the leaders or in prison or in exile or even killed, as Alexei Navalny last year, has chance. And then people started using this book as point of reference or point of expression of their thoughts about the future of Russian regime, both which was a confirmation, a living confirmation of my ideas, both in the circles of the critics of regime, but as well inside the nomenclature of the regime. The members of the regime, the high-ranking officials of the regime started to buy this book, to gift it to each other for the birthdays, to discuss it between them, because for them it was a pretext to discuss things that cannot discuss openly on Russian materials. They could ask what will happen when a dictator becomes too old and incapable to act. What happens when he dies? What happens when a war a dictator started is not going well? what happens in case of sanctions, what happens with the international pressures, how it can survive, how to survive as members of elite in case of democratic transition. All these questions were of major importance and are of major importance for the members of Russian elite. In case of a democratization, how not to lose everything, how to preserve something of what they have now. You cannot ask what happens if the war started by the dictator costs too much to the country. But you can discuss the book that treats this subject. We cannot talk about Putin's death openly, it's too dangerous, but you can talk about Salazar's or Franco's death. You cannot talk about Putin's imprisonment, it's too dangerous, but you can talk about Greek colonel's imprisonment. And then what happened, the book became a mean of a political statement for, let's say, booksellers, bookstores, when they put this book, my book, with its cover, The End of the Regime, with some books dedicated to Putin together, so that the combination made a different meaning. To put this book on the first place among bestsellers, and it was true, it was a bestseller, was a sort of political statement for the booksellers, which are private and more independent compared to the Soviet time. Then some political activists used this even during the trials against them. They ordered the book in their prison cells, and they went with this book in their trials when they were tried unjustly, as it happened in case of all political trials. Ilya Yashin, another political activist that was later exchanged with some, let's say, Russian agents last August. He ordered this in prison cell. He made the list of his orders public. He mentioned this book as a manual to read for both the members of the regime nomenclatura and to the citizens who are asking themselves what to do and how to do it, what may happen to them.